Hi everyone, and gee, the weeks are going quickly in this unit, aren't they? So here we are with topic 7 on artist research, and just a short introduction to that. And a necessarily short one in a way, because I think, well, as a cultural studies academic, it would be wrong of me to proceed without declaring, first of all, that I'm not really an artist, but I'm talking about artist research. So I need to say that up front. And I think for those artists amongst you who are working in this type of research, that it's the discussions with your supervisors that are going to be the most meaningful and useful for you, because they're going to know your particular way of researching in the arts, whether that's through media, visual art, music and performing arts, creative writing, which could be part of this as well. So just bear that in mind as I go through this. I do a little bit of artistic research, but it's not my main thing. And so that means that I tend to have a different relationship to the approach to research than somebody who works purely in a medium other than academic non-fiction, if we want to call it a genre like that. So I thought I'd just get that sort of clear from the start. But anyway, look, what I'm going to do is take us through an excursion through the readings, and we'll see what comes out of that. It's a bit of an exploration. So what I want to do this week is, and one of the complexities of talking about artist research is to be able to talk about it on its own terms and in its own terms, because often it will be compared, contrasted with other forms of research purely because it's a latecomer to the university, or to the academy as it's often called. So as a result, the methodologies around artist research are still in development, and you're part of that development process. So so in that way it's quite cutting edge what you're doing as an artist in your research, and you're furthering the field of the methodologies itself by engaging with what's available at the moment. So I thought I'd just start with the reading by Linda Candy, because I guess artist research is categorised in a number of ways, and Candy does a good job of explaining this. Two common ways of talking about artist research, of conceptualising it as a methodology, as a method. Might use the word method, preferably to methodology, being the overarching thing, the methodology, I guess, as a method. She refers to two terms in particular: practice-based research and practice-led research, which get used quite a lot. And not only are they used quite a lot, but they're used interchangeably. And you will find this throughout the literature on artist research, and you will even find it probably within the readings that you have for this unit, and you'll find it probably within the study guide itself. I think I've tried to weed out some of that stuff, but there might still be some little bits of ambiguity there. So for Candy, practice-based research is that research which necessarily needs a creative artefact along with an exegesis. So that's one way, a simple way of categorising this. That is that the artefact itself is the basis for the contribution of knowledge, and in that sense, it's the practice which leads you into the problem. So often it's, in artist research, you're starting with some sort of passion, as, what's his name, Haseman talks about it, passion for practice of some type, and the practice itself and the evolution of its ways, pathways, its chance happenings, all of those things, that engagement with materials or with sound or whatever it is, the medium that you're working with, it's that engagement which then leads on to the research, in a sense, that leads the research, in which the research is based. And so That's the practice-based approach. Practice-led research, on the other hand, for Candy, is that type of research which leads primarily to new understandings about practice, as she says, and so therefore can stand independently of the finished creative product. That is, you could be describing a new research process, method, practice, arts practice. That's where the contribution is, not necessarily in the sort of the creative artifact itself sitting alongside the exegesis. So that's two ways of considering this. And so I think, as I mentioned at the beginning of talking about this reading, if you are using either of these terms, it's really important to define it, to choose a definition from an academic source that is that you can make sense of, that makes sense to you. Choose that for your definition and back it up with that source, and just lead on from there, because you don't want to get into any arguments over practice-based and practice-led. If they're being used inconsistently in literature, then what you do to sort of solve that puzzle is to define it for yourself using a source that makes sense to you, and then move on to the next part of your thing. But whatever you're doing, by choosing one of these things, you're saying something about the type of research that you're doing, and that's the important thing. You're locating yourself in the research. So this, of course, is for the exegesis. This isn't for your actual work itself, although it gives you some clues about the work itself. In the study materials for research methods, I had a sort of quick look through some of the ways in which this type of inquiry could be framed. And I came up with studio-based creative research, practice-based or practice-led research, artist research, as this topic is called. And no doubt there are more out there. So this is just reiterating that there's a range of terms out there that we're using, and the thing to do for you is to settle on something that makes sense to you, as I mentioned, and move on. So practice-based research, which is the type of research that most artists are doing in our school. It's very rare for there to be practice-led research using Candy's definition, is always situated. That is, it's situated in creative practice. It means it's situated in your creative practice, which makes it necessarily a personal thing in some form or other, because you're extending your practice through your inquiry, as well as extending knowledge in some form or other. I guess obviously the outcomes are presented in a range of forms. It sort of speaks for itself. We've talked about creative work and exegesis, and it's a purposeful and systematic inquiry. So while, I guess this is just stating the obvious, but because we're engaged as artists in research, there is something purposeful about it. There may be an exploration that begins it, and there's of course that passion for practice of needing to get into the studio in whatever form it is and do work in order to I guess begin the process of problem finding. But we have that purpose to it. That's the purpose we're going in with as researchers. And so there's also something systematic to it. That is where, while we'll be open to chance, it doesn't mean that we're not going to be using methods to, I guess, through journaling, for example, to take note of chance, to find those little changes of direction or large changes of direction, those sort of almost points of bifurcation where we could choose one path or another and go down one rather than the other, all those sorts of things. And so it is purposeful and systematic in that sense, while also being, I guess, open to I guess, what might be thought of as an emergent process. That is mindful of the virtual possibilities in every moment of the process of creation itself. So it allows for different approaches and strategies in practice-based research, as is obvious. So many different approaches that the arts cover, using that term in sort of inverted commas. So just to, I guess, emphasize this point, clearly there's a goal in this research, and that is to produce some outcome at the end, and the outcome in terms of the both the creative artifact or artifacts and the exegesis, and that exegesis having that goal of, as we talked about last week, having a thread through it which follows an argument or the opening up of a problem and some solutions to it, even if it leaves us with a whole lot of questions at the end, which is, I guess, what we often leave our audience or viewers with about the work itself. Nevertheless, so I guess this is just emphasising that it's not unstructured. We have processes in place which we have some control over. We're using media that we have some, often, generally, some mastery over or some skill with, and so that is, I guess, what gives us that sense of a planned and goal-directed research. I guess what this is, there's a view amongst some people, and you'll probably encounter it as you make your way through the university in wider realms than just the music arts area, media area, that there's something wishy-washy and meandering and unstructured, and so it is words that might diminish the idea of artists' research. So we're just sort of emphasising this to counter that view, to show that there is something, I guess, that's there's goals in our research. We're doing the research in order to say something, in order to explore something, in order to make a statement about something, or in order to open up a range of questions around our areas of interest. Some of the issues around this, however, do mean that there's tension in that sort of creative process for having time for exploration. And I know that for a lot of artists, you'll be encountering this at the moment in research methods, because it's sort of taking up too much time and taking you away from the studio and from your practice. So it's important to make sure that you do have time for exploration, because practice-based research is about that, exploring with materials, exploring with our media, whatever they might be. I guess that means also, because of the types of product, we often have technical and budget issues that we have to work with. So that's important, obviously, to take account of, and it sort of goes without saying, doesn't it? But I guess they're part of the constraints that we might also like to highlight in the way we make decisions about our work as well. Sometimes there are issues for the inquiry if there is a lack of analysis of the work, but that's going to happen later on in the exegesis, when you're sort of starting to work on that and understand where this creative journey has taken you, and starting to tell a story about that artistic creative process and the journey and the problem that has arisen out of what you're doing, and I guess your resolution of that. So just be aware of that, especially this applies to your exegesis in particular. So it sort of does mean reading along the way as is required in order to inform your work, and be part of the journaling process if you're using a journal, which I think you should be in studio work. So making sure that then that in the end you're sort of working towards thinking about what problem your work is addressing, what question it might be responding to, if it's not really answering as such, but more in response to something, maybe in response to a provocation, and perhaps posing a provocation as well. That might be what you're going to articulate through your studio work. So artist research as a process, I guess, is something that I guess I've been already talking about as we've gone through. I just wanted to note that there are a number of readings already in the unit around this. I think the reading by Barrett back in topic 3 about artist research as a process of inquiry is an important one just to remind ourselves about. So this is sort of like a catalogue of some of the reading that you have available to you to think through some of the issues around describing your research. Artist research as problem finding is what Graham Sullivan talks about, to create in order to critique. And so that's his way of thinking about artist research. That's in that chapter on painting. And then Nikos Papastagiadis talks a lot about addressing a question, having art research grounded in the context and the field in which you're working. So in that sense, I think these 3 readings provide these sorts of discussions about artist research. So just to sum up then, I guess we could say that artist researcher projects are projects that emerge through time. We're working with emergent processes, are often personally located. Frequently they deal with affect, because I guess affect is that area of bodily engagement with work through the senses, a little bit different to emotion. So thinking about affect as being something different to emotion. So if you start looking at research on affect, it's, if you like, our emotions are often personally felt. Affects are thought of as almost, I guess, preceding emotion and being something that's often socially shared. So that sense of, for example, being part of a crowd, and however the crowd is feeling, that sense of shared affect, which then allows us, and not only allows us, but engenders in us some emotion, which is our individual emotion about how that felt. So affect is one of those things that you could think about, and the way in which your work deals with affect, affects others through communication that isn't through words, unless of course you're a creative writer. And then I guess the question is, how are you using language for affect? So thinking about that's often what we're doing in artist research. The research that we do, fortunately, it's not going to be judged by scientists or social scientists for that matter, but it's going to be confirmed through the corroboration and consensus by peers, by other artists who are your examiners, or in the wider realm, obviously, by other artists, arts audiences, arts critics. So there's a consensus view that forms around the what counts as research in this field, what counts as successful research, what counts as successful pieces of work in that sense. And so because of this, I guess there's insights that we develop through arts research that are both particular to our practice and our work, but also have some relevance to a wider context in which we're working. In the reading by Nikos Papastagiadis, he talks about different roles in the arts industry, whatever industry we might be part of, and talks about three, I guess, divisions of labour: production, distribution, and contextualisation. I guess the work of the artist, the work of the distributor or galleries or whatever form that takes, and the contextualisers, I guess, are the arts critics and the writers. And so he talks then about how, especially within an academic context within the university, we're being asked to be both producer and contextualiser, and sometimes the distributor. Although he does make some assumptions, because Papastagiadis is a writer about art, and so he still, because of his context, he sometimes also separates this artist and writer out, even though both are concerned with the context of their work. So for us within the academy, this producer and contextualiser is an important role to think about. So as I've mentioned many times, I guess when the academy gets involved in arts practice, then artists have been asked to move and work in different ways, becoming cross-disciplinary. I think artists have always been cross-disciplinary in a way, because not only we're interested in our practice, but we're also interested in something to do with the world around us and the context around us, engaging with those contexts. We certainly need to become critical in our thinking about our work, because we need to contextualise it, and we have to be able to answer those sort of why type of questions, be wise about our art in that sense. That means our writing needs to move, I guess, from being a pure record of our process and a commentary or reflection on the process, towards more of an engagement with with perception, with experience, and our perception and experience of the practice, but framing that through some sort of contextualizing thing, such as concepts from art history or movements within art history itself, which I guess are going to be concepts because they're ideas that have sort of put boundaries around different aspects of art. Could be theoretical ideas such as post-colonial theory, feminisms, critical race and whiteness, all sorts of things that are going to come up for us. But I guess sort of it means that this engagement with ideas and concepts and theory is part and parcel of our engagement with our practice as well, and working in those ways. For Papastagiadis, taking all that on, there's a dialogue, a necessary dialogue between writing and creative production. For him, both are grounded in some context and address a question, very similar to Milek and Shiloh with their question-driven model for an exegesis. Secondly, well, and as Milek and Shiloh say, the exegesis and the creative work are alternative ways of addressing a question, not necessarily repetition of the same thing. And both work, ideally both work, in process to transform each other. That may happen later on in the process, but our writing and engagement with our practice through writing, through ideas and concepts, is part and parcel of the transformation of the work itself. And in a way, that interaction of thinking through ideas, of working through our media, is going to provide fertile ground for an ongoing engaging arts practice. That's the idea here in this research mode, I guess, is to provide an ever expanding and an ever enriched medium, if you like, in that sense of a culture medium, that we grow things in a laboratory, in a bio lab, sort of in sense enriching our work and providing us with new places to go, new ideas to work through, and so on. And I think that's one of the best outcomes that we can aim for as artist researchers, is to be able to continually be finding new things to do, too many things, and so that's part of this process. It's worth talking about some of these. There's also, in the ideal world, our exegetical writing and our creative work research, our creative production. So I'm thinking, in a way, creative research in the ideal world includes exegetical writing, but there can be tensions between the two, especially if, and I think this has already been mentioned earlier, that the writing is seen as unrelated to the creative work, and you certainly want to avoid that in your final honours work. What you want to do is have a coherent package around a problem that's been found, responded to through your work. So there's a problem also, I guess, if writing is viewed purely as writing up the studio practice, because it needs to be more than that. You need to be demonstrating the research in your work, the formation of new responses, new ideas, and the why of your work. And so the writing ideally also is integrated into the creative process and production, and that will generate that coherence. So finally, to sum up, and I guess to provide the best possible gloss on the exegesis, which can be the bane of the artist researcher, is to think about exegesis and exegetical writing as helping to define your contribution to knowledge that's made by your work, to clarify for your examiner the project itself, the techniques, the solutions, the decisions made, that research journey, to articulate your perspective on the work, the why is it here type of perspective on the work that might be different to another perspective, and to be able to explain that difference. And finally, to enable some critical reflection on the project and process that can be assisting you in developing the next project. And it's not uncommon, and in fact I think it's a good thing to be talking about those things in the exegesis, the where to next, the what hasn't been done, the questions that arise for you to investigate next time. So I think that's enough of my take on artist research. I hope it's provided you with some ideas around artist research that you might like to think about and explore further. There's the readings, of course, and we'll see you next week for topic 7. Are we on topic 7? We are. Topic 8. My gosh, it goes so quick. Okay, see you next week.